Thomas and Patricia Jackson looked at each other with tired but happy smiles as they guided their children through the airport. For 2 long years, they had worked extra shifts and saved every penny for this moment. Thomas, a postman, had delivered mail through rain and snow, while Patricia had taken on weekend shifts at the local shop. All for this special trip to Florida. "Remember what we talked about?" Patricia whispered to Emma and Oliver as they approached the check-in counter. "Best behavior today." 10-year-old Emma nodded seriously, clutching her favorite book to her chest. 7-year-old Oliver bounced on his toes, unable to contain his excitement despite his promise to be good. "Jackson family party of 4. The airline worker looked up with a smile. "I see you're flying first class today." Thomas felt a flutter of pride as he handed over their passports. First class, words he never thought would apply to his family. Growing up in a small flat with 5 siblings, luxury had been a foreign concept. Patricia, raised by a single mother, had similar memories of making do with little. "Yes, that's right," Thomas said, standing a bit taller. The worker handed them their boarding passes. "You'll be boarding first. Enjoy your flight." As they waited, at the gate, Oliver tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, what's first class like? Is it really better?" Thomas ruffled his son's hair. "It's supposed to be more comfortable, with bigger seats and better food." "And they bring you drinks whenever you want," Emma added importantly, repeating what she'd heard her parents discuss. When boarding was announced, the Jacksons joined the short queue for first-class passengers. Oliver clutched his small backpack tightly, while Emma walked with careful steps, trying to appear as if she belonged. "This way, please." A smiling flight attendant directed them down the left aisle of the plane. The first-class cabin looked like something from a film. Wide, plush seats, small lamps casting a warm glow. Only a few rows with plenty of space between them. "Wow," Oliver whispered, his eyes growing round. Patricia checked their boarding passes again. "Row 2, seats A through D." As they settled in, Oliver ran his small hands over the smooth armrest. "Look, Mum, the seats are so big," he whispered. Though his excitement made it louder than intended, Patricia smiled warmly at her son. "That's right, love. We worked hard for this special trip." Emma carefully placed her book in the pocket in front of her, examining everything with quiet wonder. She had always been the more reserved of the 2 children, taking after her father's thoughtful nature. Thomas arranged their hand luggage in the overhead compartment, conscious of not disturbing the businesswoman across the aisle who was already typing on her laptop. The Jacksons had spent weeks preparing for this flight, practicing proper airplane behavior with the children every evening after dinner. "Remember to use your inside voices," Patricia had reminded them again and again. "And always say please and thank you." Now, watching his family settle into their first-class seats, Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. His own parents had never been able to afford holidays. The farthest he'd traveled as a child was to his grandmother's house 2 towns over. Yet, here were his children, about to fly across the ocean in the front of the plane. A flight attendant approached with a tray of drinks. "Would you care for a welcome beverage? We have juice, water, or champagne." "May I have apple juice, please?" Oliver asked politely, remembering his manners. "Water for me, please," Emma said, sitting up straight. The flight attendant smiled and handed them their drinks. Very good choices. Patricia squeezed Thomas's hand as they watched their children carefully hold their glasses, trying not to spill a drop. For the Jacksons, this wasn't just a holiday. It was the culmination of countless overtime shifts and careful budgeting. A testament to their determination to give their children experiences they themselves had never had growing up. "We did it," Thomas whispered to his wife. "We did," Patricia agreed, blinking back tears of joy. As the other passengers boarded, Emma pulled out her book again, while Oliver gazed out the window at the luggage being loaded onto the plane. Their excitement was visible, but contained, just as they had practiced. Thomas settled back into his seat, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over him. Whatever happened on their holiday, this moment, seeing the joy on his children's faces, the pride in their careful behavior, the wonder as they experienced something new, this moment made all the hard work worthwhile. Remember to apply proper citations if you use the web search or web fetch tools. Every specific claim from search results should be wrapped in tags. The index attribute should indicate the document and sentence indices that support the claim. 30. Plane hummed as it prepared for takeoff. The Jacksons settled into their plush seats, still taking in the luxury around them. Emma had her nose buried in her book while Oliver pressed his face against the window, watching workers load luggage below. Most of the flight attendants moved through the cabin with warm smiles, offering drinks and hot towels to the first-class passengers. Everyone except for Margaret Wilson. Margaret was tall, with perfect blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her uniform was spotless, her makeup flawless. She greeted an older gentleman in a business suit with a wide smile. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Lovely to see you again. Your usual scotch on the rocks?" "You remembered, thank you, Margaret," the man said with delight. She moved to the next passenger, a woman with expensive jewelry. "Would you care for champagne?" "Madame, we have an excellent vintage today." Thomas noticed that Margaret had served every passenger in first class except for his family. Oliver's small voice broke the silence. "Dad, I'm really thirsty." "Of course, son." Thomas looked around for Margaret, who seemed to be deliberately turning away whenever she neared their row. He raised his hand politely. Margaret pretended not to see. He tried again, and finally she approached with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some water for the children, please," Thomas asked. Margaret looked at the family with cold eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" she asked loudly, checking their tickets with obvious suspicion. "First-class passengers usually know the boarding procedure." Her voice carried across the cabin. Several passengers looked up. Emma glanced at her mother with confusion in her eyes. Oliver, feeling the tension, shrank into his seat. Thomas felt heat rise to his face but kept his voice steady. "Yes, we have first-class tickets," he replied politely, showing their boarding passes again. "We're quite certain we're in the correct seats." Margaret examined the tickets with narrowed eyes as if expecting to find them fake. Finally, she nodded curtly. "I'll bring water shortly." Patricia reached for Thomas's hand under the armrest, squeezing it gently. She whispered, "It's all right. Let's just enjoy the flight." But the water didn't come. Margaret returned with a tray of welcome drinks for the row behind them, then the row across, carefully avoiding eye contact with the Jacksons. 15 minutes passed. Oliver's thirst grew. "Mum, when will we get water?" he whispered. Patricia pressed the call button. Margaret appeared, her smile vanishing when she saw who had called. "Yes?" she asked coldly. "We asked for water some time ago," Patricia said gently. "The children are quite thirsty." "We are very busy with takeoff preparations," Margaret replied, though she had just spent several minutes chatting with a businessman about golf courses. She returned later with 4 plastic cups of water, placing them roughly on their trays, while other passengers received crystal glasses with lemon slices. Across the aisle sat William Baker, a man who flew first class every week for business. He had noticed everything: the way Margaret fawned over other passengers, the way she accidentally skipped the Jacksons during the welcome drink service, the raised eyebrows when they requested pillows after everyone else had received them without asking. William saw how Thomas and Patricia maintained their dignity, how they whispered reassurances to their confused children, how they said, "Thank you," even when treated poorly. When Margaret walked away after another snippy remark about proper first-class etiquette, William pulled out his phone. Discreetly, keeping it low on his lap, he began recording. "Is everything all right with your meal, Mr. Reynolds?" Margaret's voice was sweet as honey as she attended to the businessman. Then, moments later, her tone changed completely when she addressed the Jacksons. "You need to put your tray down properly," she said sharply to Emma, who was struggling with the unfamiliar mechanism. William kept recording. He captured how Margaret brought extra bread to every table except the Jacksons, how she bumped Thomas's elbow without apologizing, how she sighed loudly when Oliver asked very politely for a second juice. An elderly woman named Mary Thompson sat nearby, watching everything with increasing disapproval. She had been flying first class for decades and had never witnessed such behavior from staff. "Young man," she whispered to William, noticing his recording, "I hope you're documenting this. It's absolutely disgraceful." William nodded. "Don't worry," he whispered back. "I'm getting it all." The Jacksons tried to focus on their excitement about Florida. Thomas pointed out interesting cloud formations to Oliver. Patricia helped Emma find her place in her book after the turbulence. They spoke softly, behaved impeccably, and tried to ignore Margaret's cold stares, but William Baker saw everything, and his phone recorded everything. The discriminatory treatment couldn't continue much longer without consequences. The evidence was growing with every passing minute. The flight had been in the air for nearly an hour. The Jackson family tried their best to enjoy the experience despite Margaret's cold treatment. Thomas read a magazine, while Patricia helped Emma with a puzzle book. Oliver watched the clouds through his window, his small face pressed against the glass. When the meal service began, Margaret moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She laid white tablecloths on each tray table with a flourish, except for the Jacksons, whose tablecloths she practically tossed at them. "Thank you," Patricia said politely, smoothing the cloth herself. Margaret didn't respond. She returned moments later with trays of food. The other passengers received detailed explanations of their gourmet meals. The Jacksons got their trays, placed before them in silence. Oliver looked at his chicken with wide eyes. "This looks yummy," he whispered to his mother. Patricia smiled, cutting his meat into smaller pieces. "Remember to eat slowly," she reminded him. The boy nodded, carefully, picking up his fork. He was trying so hard to follow all the rules his parents had taught him, but as he reached for his water cup, his small hand bumped it. The cup tipped. It wasn't a big spill, just a few drops that landed on his own tray table. Oliver froze, his face crumpling with dismay. "I'm sorry," he whispered, looking terrified. Before Patricia could reassure him, Margaret appeared as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She swooped down on them like a hawk. "This is exactly why some people shouldn't be in first class," she said loudly, making no effort to lower her voice. Her eyes swept over the family with undisguised disdain. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy where this sort of behavior is expected." The cabin fell silent. Even the constant hum of conversation stopped as passengers turned to look. Oliver's bottom lip trembled. Emma stared at her lap, her cheeks red with embarrassment. Patricia's face burned with humiliation as she quickly grabbed napkins to clean up the tiny spill. "It's just a small accident," she said quietly. "We're very sorry." Thomas watched his wife's hands shake as she dabbed at the water drops. He saw the tears gathering in Oliver's eyes. Something shifted inside him, a quiet, determined anger replacing his previous patience. He looked directly at Margaret. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice firm but controlled. "That comment was inappropriate. May I have your employee number?" "Please?" Margaret's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed. Instead of providing the information, she crossed her arms defensively. "Are you threatening me? I can have you removed from this flight for being disruptive." Thomas blinked in disbelief. "Disruptive? We've been nothing but polite while you've—" "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," Margaret interrupted, though Thomas hadn't raised his voice at all. From across the aisle, William Baker stood up, the businessman who had been quietly recording. Margaret's behavior could stay silent no longer. "The only disruption here is your behavior," he said firmly. "I've been recording your treatment of this family since we boarded, and it's completely unacceptable." Margaret's face paled. "Recording? That's against airline policy." "Actually," William replied, "the airline policy forbids recording safety. Demonstrations and crew members performing safety duties. It says nothing about documenting discriminatory behavior." Several other passengers began nodding in agreement. The businessman in the expensive suit spoke up. "I've noticed it too. You've treated this family differently from everyone else." A woman in row 1 turned around. "You skipped them during the hot towel service. I watched you do it deliberately." Mary Thompson, an elderly woman with silver hair and pearl earrings, spoke with the confidence of someone who knew her worth. "I've been flying first class for 40 years, young lady, and I've never seen such poor service or blatant rudeness." Margaret looked around, suddenly realizing she was surrounded by witnesses. Her confident demeanor faltered. I've been providing standard service to everyone." "Standard service?" William held up his phone. "I have 27 minutes of video showing otherwise." Oliver wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Patricia put her arm around him protectively. Emma sat very still, watching everything with wide eyes. Thomas took a deep breath. We paid for these tickets just like everyone else. We saved for 2 years to take our children on this special trip. All we want is to be treated with the same respect you've shown to other passengers. Mary Thompson nodded approvingly. Well said, young man. Margaret's face flushed red. She looked around for allies but found none. The entire first-class cabin had turned against her, united in support of the Jackson family. I'll get my supervisor, she muttered, turning to leave. I think that's an excellent idea, William said, his phone still recording. As Margaret hurried away, something remarkable happened. The businessman offered Oliver a chocolate from his own dessert tray. The woman, in row 1, smiled warmly at Emma. Mary Thompson reached across the aisle to pat Patricia's hand. Don't you worry, dear, the elderly woman said kindly. This will be sorted out properly. No one deserves to be treated that way. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. Their holiday had barely begun, and already they had witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature. The tension in the first-class cabin hung in the air like a storm cloud. Margaret had disappeared toward the front of the plane, leaving the passengers murmuring among themselves. Oliver wiped away his tears while Patricia held him close. Is everything all right? Emma asked her father in a small voice. Thomas squeezed her hand. It will be, sweetheart. Sometimes people aren't kind, but look around. There are many more good people than bad ones. True to his words, the other passengers had formed a protective circle of support around the Jackson family. William Baker sat with his phone ready, reviewing the footage he'd captured. Mary Thompson had moved to sit in the empty seat beside them, her dignified presence a comfort to the children. When I was a girl, Mary told Emma, my mother taught me that real class has nothing to do with money and everything to do with how you treat others. She glanced toward the direction Margaret had gone. That woman may work in first class, but she has no class at all. Emma gave a small smile, the first since the trouble began. A tall man in a crisp uniform appeared at the front of the cabin. Robert Brown, the lead flight attendant, had a kind face and calm demeanor. Unlike Margaret, his eyes held genuine warmth as he surveyed the scene. I understand there's been an incident, he said, approaching the Jackson family. Margaret has made some accusations. William stood immediately. If I may, sir, he said, holding up his phone, I think you should see this before making any judgments. Robert nodded and took the phone, watching the screen with increasing concern. His professional expression couldn't hide his dismay as the video showed Margaret's pattern of behavior toward the Jacksons. Mary spoke up from her seat. I've been watching this family since boarding, she said firmly. The children have been better behaved than most adults I've flown with. The only problem on this flight has been your colleague's disgraceful attitude. Other passengers joined in, each sharing what they had witnessed. The businessman described how Margaret had skipped the Jacksons during several service rounds. A young woman mentioned the tablecloth incident. A retired teacher pointed out how polite the children had been, despite the poor treatment. Robert looked genuinely troubled. He turned to the Jacksons. Sir, ma'am, on behalf of the airline, I want to offer my sincere apologies. This is not the standard of service we aim to provide. Thank you, Thomas said simply. Robert hesitated, then made a decision. If you'll excuse me for a moment. He walked to the front of the plane and picked up the aircraft phone. Though they couldn't hear his words, the passengers could see him speaking intently, his face serious. After a few minutes, Robert returned to address the first-class cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. There will be a slight delay before we continue our journey. Thank you for your patience. The minutes ticked by. Oliver had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, exhausted from the emotional ordeal. Emma had returned to her book, though her eyes darted up whenever someone walked past. Thomas and Patricia exchanged worried glances, wondering what would happen next. Then a new figure appeared at the front of the cabin. A woman in a smart business suit walked confidently down the aisle. Her badge identified her as Elizabeth Clark, Customer Service Director. She made her way directly to the Jackson family, extending her hand first to Thomas, then to Patricia. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, I'm Elizabeth Clark. I happened to be monitoring flights today when Robert contacted me about this situation. Elizabeth crouched down to eye level with Emma. "Hello there. Is this your first time flying with us?" Emma nodded. "Shyly, I'm so sorry it hasn't been the wonderful experience you deserve," Elizabeth said genuinely. Then she stood to address the family, speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "What you've experienced today goes against everything our airline stands for. I've reviewed the situation and the evidence provided by your fellow passengers." William nodded in approval. Mary Thompson sat up straighter in her seat. Elizabeth turned to face Margaret, who had returned to the cabin and now stood at the front, her face drained of colour. "Margaret, could you join us, please?" Margaret walked forward slowly, her earlier confidence completely gone. She couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "Margaret," Elizabeth said, her voice firm but controlled, "your actions today reflect a pattern of behaviour that has been reported before. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind." Margaret began to sputter excuses. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" William interrupted. "Is it protocol to serve everyone but this family? To speak rudely to their children? To question their right to be here?" Elizabeth held up her hand. "Mr. Baker, thank you. We have all the evidence we need." She turned back to Margaret. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about similar behaviour from you, though. It is certainly the most thoroughly documented." The entire cabin held its breath. Oliver had woken up and was watching with wide eyes. Patricia kept her arm around him protectively. Thomas sat tall, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. Elizabeth's next words would change. Everything. Elizabeth Clark stood tall as she delivered her verdict, her voice clear and unwavering. The first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Even the usual airplane sounds seemed to fade away as everyone listened intently. "Margaret Wilson, your employment with this airline is terminated, effective immediately," Elizabeth announced, firmly. "Please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. Another crew member will take your place." Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. Her face shifted between pale white and bright red as the words sank in. You can't do that," she stammered. "Not here, not like this." "I can and I have," Elizabeth replied calmly. "Your behavior violates our core values and our explicit anti-discrimination policies. This decision is final." Robert appeared at Margaret's side. "I'll escort you to collect your things," he said quietly. Margaret looked around the cabin desperately, seeking sympathy but finding none. The businessman who had complained about her service earlier now looked at his newspaper, pretending not to notice her distress. Mary Thompson raised an eyebrow, her expression making it clear that justice was being served. As Margaret was led away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't look back at the Jackson family. She simply walked down the aisle and disappeared. From sight, a hushed silence hung over the cabin. Oliver tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Is it over now?" he whispered. Patricia nodded, hugging him close. "Yes, love, it's over." Elizabeth turned back to the Jacksons, her professional demeanor softening. "On behalf of our airline, I want to offer you our deepest apologies. Your entire family has been upgraded to our VIP status, which includes special services for the remainder of your journey and all future flights with us." She handed Thomas a golden envelope. "Inside you'll find details about your new status, as well as vouchers for your next holiday. We want to make sure your children's first flying experience ends on a positive note." The other passengers broke into spontaneous applause. William smiled and gave Thomas a thumbs up from across the aisle. Mary Thompson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Thank you," Thomas said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this," he gestured to the envelope, "but for standing up for what's right." "It's the very least we could do," Elizabeth replied. "Now, is there anything else your family needs before we continue our journey?" Emma, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Could I please have another juice?" she asked in a small voice. Elizabeth smiled warmly. "Of course you can, sweetheart. And how about some chocolate cake too? I believe we have some special treats in the galley." The atmosphere in the cabin changed completely after Margaret's departure. A new flight attendant named David took her place, treating every passenger with genuine warmth. He made funny faces that made Oliver giggle. He discussed books with Emma. He made sure Thomas and Patricia had everything they needed without them having to ask. The rest of the flight passed in comfort. When they landed in Florida, a special representative met the Jacksons at the gate with VIP passes to several theme parks. Their hotel had been upgraded to a luxury suite at no additional cost. For 2 weeks, the family enjoyed their dream holiday. They rode roller coasters and met cartoon characters. They swam in the ocean and built sandcastles. They took hundreds of photos of smiling faces and magical moments. But the story didn't end with their holiday. One evening back home, Thomas opened his laptop to find thousands of messages from people around the world. William Baker had shared his video online, and it had gone viral. The incident had sparked an important conversation about treating all people with dignity and respect. 1 month later, the airline announced a new training program for all staff, using this incident as a teaching example. They invited Thomas to speak at their headquarters about his family's experience. In a television interview, the reporter asked Patricia how it felt to be at the center of such attention. "We didn't want attention," Patricia explained gently. "We just wanted to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. What matters is that our children learned an important lesson. Stand up for yourself with dignity and never let anyone make you feel less worthy." As for Oliver and Emma, they returned from their holiday with not just memories of Florida sunshine, but the knowledge that justice can prevail when good people stand together against discrimination. Emma wrote a school essay about her experience. "The bad part wasn't as important as what happened after," she wrote. "I learned that there are more good people than bad people in the world." Oliver drew a picture of the airplane, but instead of drawing Margaret, he filled his picture with the faces of William, Mary, Elizabeth, and David, the people who had shown kindness when it mattered most. The Jackson family would fly again, and next time they would board with confidence, knowing they belonged wherever they chose to go.